A man walked into a lobby, calm, professional, a federal badge, in his case a meeting on the 5th floor. The marble floor gleamed beneath his steps. No threat, no raised voice, just purpose. But 9 minutes later he was on the ground, hands out, surrounded, treated like a suspect. Why? Because someone thought he didn't belong. No questions, just a call, just a glance, just fear dressed up as protocol. And the officer leading the takedown, he had applied for a spot on a federal task force, reporting directly to the man he put on the floor. This wasn't about safety, it was about assumption. And sometimes the cost of assumption is dignity. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? It was just after 10 in the morning when Elijah Carter walked through the revolving glass doors of Orion Technologies, a tall man in a gray blazer and navy slacks, carrying a brown leather document case that looked almost too soft to belong in a building full of hardened secrets. The lobby greeted him with its polished marble floors, cold white lighting, and a silence so sterile it almost hummed in his ears. The faint click of his leather shoes echoed off the tall walls, punctuated only by the distant murmur of a receptionist on the phone and the soft whoosh of the HVAC system overhead. He paused near a metal sculpture that seemed both expensive and meaningless, scanning the digital directory while his right hand brushed the badge, clipped neatly at his belt, out of sight but never out of reach. He wasn't a man prone to nerves, not after 20 years in intelligence, but there was something about corporate lobbies that made him tighten his jaw just slightly, as if his presence in these spaces was always subject to second-guessing. Elijah didn't fidget or pace. He simply stood still, one wireless earbud in place, reviewing the encrypted notes for his upcoming briefing. Occasionally, he'd murmur something low and clipped, barely louder than his breath, more to test phrasing than to be heard. Anyone paying attention would have seen a man preparing for a high-stakes meeting, not a threat, not a problem, just a professional doing his job. Behind the reception desk, Rachel DeWitt tilted her head slightly, her fingers hovering above her keyboard as she studied him from a distance. She was young, early 30s at most, in a fitted blazer, 2 shades too bright for the somber decor, her eyes sharp with the kind of curiosity that doesn't always lead to questions. Instead of walking over, instead of asking if he needed help, she leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "He's been standing there for 5 minutes. He's talking to himself." The other receptionist barely looked up. "He's probably waiting for someone." Rachel didn't let it go. "I don't know. Something just feels off." Elijah hadn't noticed her, or if he had, he didn't let it show. He'd been in enough rooms where suspicion floated just beneath the surface, wearing a smile, sipping coffee, and asking for ID. It didn't have the authority to request. It was always there in the glance that lasted 1 beat too long, in the silence that waited for him to explain his presence without invitation. He was used to that. What he never got used to was how often it came from people with no real reason to doubt him. His fingers tapped the edge of his case softly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture so small it could have meant anything: fatigue, thoughtfulness, readiness. But to Rachel, watching from 20 feet away, it was a cue. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for building security, her voice low but decisive. "Hi, I'm at the front desk in the main lobby. There's a man standing near the art installation. He's acting kind of strange, talking to himself. Not sure if he belongs here." She hesitated just a breath, then added it. "He's acting suspicious." Elijah was still unaware of the call, still calmly reviewing the threat matrix from a week-old data breach that had raised flags in 3 federal offices. He was waiting for the head of data security, who was 10 minutes late, but Elijah didn't mind. He never showed up early by accident. It was always calculated time, to observe time, to be observed time, to read the temperature of a room before stepping fully into it. Downstairs, a pair of uniformed officers received a vague dispatch. Possible suspicious person in the Orion lobby. No weapons reported. Might be casing the place. That was enough to send a patrol car, rolling tires, crackling over the smooth concrete lot just outside. Inside, the lobby air remained heavy and bright, like a gallery built to impress but not to welcome. Elijah exhaled slowly, steady as stone, then turned slightly to face the elevators just in case his contact appeared. He caught a glimpse of Rachel behind the desk, her eyes darting back to her monitor, her expression unreadable. He'd seen that face before, more times than he cared to count. At that moment he felt something shift, not around him, but within him, a kind of quiet tightening beneath the calm, like a musician recognizing a wrong note before it's played. He didn't know the call had already gone out. He didn't know that 2 officers were 2 minutes away. All he knew was that the energy in the room had changed, the kind of shift that comes right before you're asked to prove you exist for the right reasons. And still he didn't move, because in places like this, sometimes moving too fast is more dangerous than standing still. Outside, the low hum of traffic carried on like any ordinary weekday, the kind of background noise you forget until it disappears. But inside the Orion Technologies lobby, something unseen had already begun to change, folding the air into something taut and slightly off-kilter, like a wire pulled tight beneath the surface. Elijah Carter still stood near the sculpture, his posture unthreatening, one hand resting gently against the handle of his case, his eyes scanning the elevator panel across the room, watching for the light to flicker. His expression was calm, even thoughtful, but behind his quiet, his mind ticked through subtle shifts, the way the receptionist kept glancing over, the way her fingers never quite settled on her keyboard again after that call. He didn't need confirmation to know something had shifted. In his line of work, you learn to sense intent the way others feel temperature. He thought briefly about moving toward the front desk, about initiating a polite conversation to break whatever tension had been brewing. But he'd played that move before and seen it go sideways, seen the moment someone's smile tightened into suspicion when they realized he wasn't just tall and confident, but black too. Instead, he stayed where he was, centered, rooted, and made himself smaller, not by shrinking but by softening his presence, his breathing slower, his eyes non-confrontational, his voice silent. It wasn't fear that held him back, but the weight of understanding exactly how perception worked, how quickly it could tip, and how often it tipped on people who looked like him. At the front desk, Rachel DeWitt put the phone down with a soft click that echoed more loudly in her ears than she expected, and for a moment she kept her gaze fixed on her screen, pretending to read an email that wasn't there. Her coworker glanced at her brows, raised slightly, but said nothing, perhaps sensing that nothing productive would come from questioning her judgment in that moment. Rachel folded her arms across her chest and stood up, peering discreetly through the glass panels of the lobby entrance, her body tense with a mixture of certainty and doubt, the kind that only grows louder in silence. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, maybe someone stepping out of a car with a clipboard and a badge, maybe nothing at all. But what she saw instead was the flash of red and blue as a patrol car rolled into the turnaround, its tires gliding slowly over the clean pavement. Inside the cruiser, Officer Brent Daly sat up straighter, adjusting his sunglasses with one hand while the other hovered near his radio. He read the call summary again, suspicious male, dark clothing, possibly casing a secure area, and his jaw clenched slightly, as if the vagueness of it somehow validated his readiness to act. "You believe this one's real?" he asked, without looking at his partner. Officer Lena Torres, quiet but alert, checked the address again and gave a small shrug. "It's vague," she said, "but enough to check out. Might be nothing." Daly gave a short, humorless laugh. "It's always nothing until it isn't." They pulled up slowly to the curb, the cruiser hissing softly as it settled into park, and for a brief second neither of them moved. Then Daly unhooked his seatbelt with a deliberate snap and pushed the door open. "Let's make it quick," he muttered. Torres followed more cautiously, adjusting her body cam and taking in the layout of the building before stepping inside. The lobby doors whooshed open automatically, and both officers entered with the practiced ease of people who'd done this dozens of times, feet steady, hands near their belts, eyes scanning every face and corner before settling on the only person standing alone. Elijah felt them before he saw them. The energy shift was subtle but unmistakable, like a cold draft where there had been none a moment ago. He turned slowly with purpose, but without suddenness, just enough to see the 2 officers approaching from the far end of the lobby. Their uniforms were crisp, and their faces unreadable. But he knew exactly what was coming the moment their eyes met his. There was no greeting, no easing into the moment, just a voice firm and official cutting through the air like a blade. "Excuse me, sir. Can we have a word?" Elijah nodded, once polite but firm. "Of course. "What's this about? Need you to step away from the wall, hands visible," Daly said. A pause. Not long enough to be called hesitation, but just long enough for Elijah's mind to race through every possible outcome, every choice he could make right now, and the weight each one carried. "I'm with the Bureau," he said calmly, his voice low but clear. "I'm here for a scheduled meeting." "Bureau of what?" Daly asked, his tone carrying an edge. "FBI," Elijah replied, watching Daly's eyes narrow ever so slightly. "You got ID?" "I do," Elijah said, reaching slowly for the zipper on his case. "Let me get it." "Sir, don't reach." The words came out fast, sharp, landing in the room like a warning shot. Elijah froze instantly, hand halfway to the case, not because he was afraid, but because he understood the math, how quickly things could spiral, how easily fear could rewrite truth. "I just told you I was getting my ID," he said, voice still even, but this time with something harder behind it. Not defiance, clarity. Torres took a small step closer, her eyes darting between them, sensing something in Elijah's voice that Daly seemed determined to ignore. "Let's do this slowly," she said. "Place the case on the ground. Keep your hands where we can see them." Elijah did exactly that, kneeling in one smooth motion, the case gently meeting the floor as if it were made of glass. His breathing stayed calm, but inside something cold and sharp had begun to unfold, not fear but a kind of exhausted readiness, like someone stepping into a storm they'd already memorized. "My badge is in the side pocket," he said. "You're welcome to retrieve it." Daly didn't move. The seconds dragged out like hours. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't blink, just waited. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exist in a space that refuses to see you as anything but a threat. The tension in the room didn't arrive all at once. It crept in gradually like fog rolling in off a cold river, subtle and slow, until suddenly it was everywhere. Elijah remained kneeling by his case, his hands visible, fingers relaxed, but deliberate every movement, careful and economical, like someone disarming a bomb with nothing but breath and patience. The marble floor beneath his knees was colder than he expected, but he didn't shift, didn't squirm, just stayed rooted there, knowing full well how a single twitch could be misread by someone already looking for justification. Officer Daly still hadn't moved, hadn't reached for the ID, hadn't even acknowledged the perfectly calm offer Elijah had made. Instead, he stood rigid jaw, set eyes locked onto Elijah, like a hunter waiting for a tell, as though the truth sitting neatly inside that leather case was somehow less persuasive than the story playing out in his head. Officer Torres, to her credit, had stepped a little closer, not aggressive, not passive, just present, her eyes flicking from the satchel to Elijah's face, to her partner's tightening posture. Elijah took in every detail, not with fear, but with trained clarity, the way a field agent learns to read rooms before he reads people. He noted the slight twitch in Daly's right hand near his holster, the way the officer's stance widened just a little, like he was bracing for impact that hadn't come and likely never would. He heard the faint buzz of the elevator still idle behind him, the hum of HVAC above, and the subtle but unmistakable silence from the receptionist's desk, where Rachel now stood, frozen arms crossed defensively, as though daring someone to question her call. "I'm supposed to meet with Orion's cybersecurity director," Elijah said, voice calm even. "It's a federal matter involving potential data breaches. You can confirm it with Director Maya Hall or the Bureau's regional field office in Arlington." Daly didn't answer. Instead, his eyes narrowed like he was trying to match Elijah's face to a mental list of mugshots that didn't exist. Torres shifted her weight, her expression neutral but alert, and for the first time her voice entered the space again. "What's in the satchel?" she asked. "Only work materials," Elijah replied. "Encrypted laptop briefing documents, a federal badge, and one agency-issued sidearm concealed left hip. Fully authorized." Daly's voice came in sharp, a half-second too late. "Your arm?" "Yes," Elijah replied, unflinching. Sig Sauer Bureau standard, holstered and untouched. Another pause, longer this time, and for a brief, brittle second, Elijah thought Torres might step in and de-escalate the entire thing with a calm voice and a simple decision, but she didn't. She hesitated just slightly, but enough to feel like permission for Daly to push forward, to lean into a narrative he'd already decided was real. On the ground, Daly barked a little louder than necessary, the command snapping across the lobby like a whip. Both hands flat, no sudden moves. Elijah's spine stiffened for a fraction of a second, but he obeyed without comment, lowering himself until he was seated, fully knees, bent hands, palm down on the glossy stone floor. He didn't plead, didn't protest, didn't ask again for anyone to check the ID that remained untouched less than 3 feet away. Instead, he locked eyes with Daly, not with challenge but with something steadier, restraint maybe, or the quiet grief of someone who'd known this moment would come again, even if he didn't know when. "You're making a mistake," Elijah said softly. "But I'll cooperate. I won't move unless directed." Daly didn't respond. He hovered like a hawk circling something it didn't fully understand. Behind him, Rachel had retreated partially behind the desk, her face pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter with whitened knuckles. She didn't speak, didn't try to clarify what she'd seen or hadn't seen. Her role was already played, and now the scene was unfolding, according to a script no one had written, but everyone seemed to know by heart. Torres finally moved closer, crouching beside the satchel as Elijah nodded toward the left side pocket. "ID's there. Metal badge holder with photo credentials. You're welcome to confirm." She opened the pocket slowly, carefully, her eyes on Elijah the entire time, and pulled out the heavy badge case. It clicked open in her gloved hands, and for a moment the silence in the lobby thickened. The badge shone under the overhead lights, clean, official, undeniable. A decade of service, a dozen commendations, a lifetime of knowing this still might not be enough. She looked at the photo, then back at Elijah, then over at Daly. "Seems legit," she said, her voice quiet but certain. Daly didn't move. Elijah remained still, shoulders squared, eyes clear. The truth had been spoken aloud, but it hadn't landed yet, not where it needed to. "You can call Maya Hall right now," Elijah offered again. "She'll verify everything." Still no movement. Daly just stood there staring like he was trying to find the crack that would make it all fall apart. Elijah didn't blink. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before in airports, in parking lots, in moments that could have turned fatal if not for sheer composure. This wasn't about a badge. This was about who got the benefit of the doubt and who didn't. The elevator behind them chimed softly. Somewhere above the meeting Elijah was supposed to attend was beginning without him. Down here, though, time had bent inward, stretching out these minutes into something much heavier than a simple misunderstanding. No words were spoken as the lobby doors opened again. 2 more building security staff entered, eyes scanning the surreal tableau before them, an agent on the ground, a badge on the floor, and 2 officers who seemed unsure of what they were holding on to anymore. The truth was right there, gleaming in Torres's hand. But sometimes the truth isn't enough, not when fear wears a badge and refuses to let go. The floor beneath Elijah Carter was cold enough to creep through his trousers and settle into his joints, but he didn't shift, didn't complain, didn't even allow the discomfort to register on his face. He sat upright, not slouched, not resigned, but poised back, straight palms on the polished stone eyes, calmly tracking every movement around him with the same unblinking patience that had once helped him navigate undercover operations in far less forgiving environments. His satchel, still zipped, rested a few inches away, untouched, except for where Officer Torres had retrieved the badge that now glinted faintly in her hand under the overhead lights. There was a stillness in the room, not the peaceful kind, but a kind of compressed air, like everyone was waiting for something to pop or crack, a silence held together by tension and the refusal to name what everyone already felt. The receptionist, Rachel, had moved a step back behind the counter, her eyes darting between the officers and the man she had called suspicious. Only 10 minutes earlier, her arms now folded tightly across her chest, as if bracing herself for a storm she wasn't sure how to explain. Her face had shifted less, sure now, more pale and maybe even a little ashamed, but her mouth stayed shut, unwilling to reverse what she'd set in motion. Daly still hadn't taken his eyes off. Elijah still hadn't holstered his posture, as though the badge, the credentials, and the calm composure in front of him weren't enough to untangle the narrative he'd already committed to. His hand lingered just close enough to his hip for it to mean something, but not quite enough for anyone to call it an overt threat. And that was the trick of it. Elijah thought how threat never had to be loud to be real, how fear could hum like a wire under the skin without anyone ever raising their voice. "You understand how this looks, Daly," finally said, his voice low but edged with something harder, something brittle. "I understand how you think it looks," Elijah replied, still seated, still calm, his voice, the kind of even that comes not from peace but from practice. "But the badge in your partner's hand tells you what it is." Torres shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment thickening with each second that passed. She looked down at the ID again, then at Elijah, then over at her partner, and it was clear in her eyes that she knew. She knew the facts lined up, knew the man on the floor wasn't a suspect, wasn't casing a building, wasn't anything but what he said he was. But knowing and acting on that knowing were two different things, and something in her posture said she hadn't yet decided which path to take. "We should call it in," she murmured. Not quite an order, not quite a suggestion, just a truth floating in the stale air between them. Daly didn't answer. He just kept watching Elijah, like he was still waiting for the crack in the calm, the slip in the story, the moment that would give him permission to escalate. But it never came. Elijah sat with the stillness of someone who had been here before, someone who knew that sometimes all you could do was hold your ground in silence and let the weight of your dignity speak louder than any explanation ever could. Behind the desk, Rachel finally spoke, her voice thinner than before, barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go like this." Elijah turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her without fully shifting his body. There was no anger in his face, no accusation, just the tired clarity of a man who'd seen the same movie play out too many times to flinch. "What did you mean for it to do?" he asked softly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her gaze dropping to the floor like the answer might be hiding in the marble tiles. Torres took a breath, then spoke with more certainty this time. "We have confirmed credentials. Federal agent. Everything matches." Daly finally responded, but not with action, just words. "That doesn't mean we don't verify. Doesn't mean we drop our guard." "It does," Elijah said, quietly, "mean you reassess the threat level. That's what protocol is for. De-escalation, not humiliation." The words weren't sharp, but they carried weight, the kind that settled into the chest and stayed there long after the moment passed. They weren't said to provoke or punish, but to point at something deeper, a failure, not of procedure but of perception. The security guards who had arrived a few minutes earlier remained near the entrance, saying nothing, watching everything. One of them, older, gray at the temples, whispered something to Torres, just a name probably, or a confirmation, and she nodded slowly. The lobby remained frozen in a strange balance, as though no one knew how to unwind the moment without losing face. And yet that was the point, wasn't it? That face, reputation, pride, the illusion of control was sometimes the only thing that kept people from admitting they were wrong, even when the evidence gleamed right in front of them. "I'm not reaching for anything," Elijah said again, his voice softer now, more tired than angry. "If you need to contact my superior, do it. But I'm not standing up until I know I won't be treated like a threat for doing so." Torres looked at Daly again, this time with more steel in her posture, as though silently daring him to keep pushing a situation that no longer had any justification. She held out the badge toward him, offering it like proof he'd refused to accept until now. He didn't take it. The elevator behind them chimed again, a soft ding that broke the silence with surprising clarity. Elijah didn't turn, but he knew who it would be. And as the doors began to open, a shadow stepped out, heels tapping with unhurried confidence on the polished floor. Director Maya Hall entered like a question that had already been answered, eyes scanning the scene, breath catching just slightly as she took in her agent on the floor, two officers standing over him, and a badge still hanging in the balance. "What the hell is going on here?" she asked, not loud but with the kind of voice that made everyone look up. And just like that, the moment began to shift, not because someone demanded it, but because truth once spoken with authority has a way of rearranging everything. Director Maya Hall stepped fully into the lobby with the composure of someone who had commanded rooms far more hostile than this one, but even she couldn't hide the flash of disbelief in her eyes when she saw Elijah on the floor. Her heels clicked in deliberate rhythm across the marble, the sound sharp against the quiet as she crossed the space without breaking stride, her charcoal suit catching the light in clean angles, a manila folder in one hand and a silver badge clipped to her waistband just above the hip. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was enough to tilt the atmosphere like a table being set right after a storm had tipped everything sideways. Elijah didn't move, didn't even shift his weight, but there was something in his expression that softened just a fraction when he saw her, a subtle exhale through the nose, a tiny drop in the shoulders, the kind of minute change that only someone who knew him well would notice. Maya stopped 2 steps from him, glanced once at the officers, then down at her agent with a look that blended concern with a kind of controlled fury. She tilted her head toward Torres and asked evenly but with undeniable authority, "Can someone please explain to me why my top agent is sitting on the ground in a commercial lobby?" Torres swallowed hard and stood up a little straighter, her fingers tightening around the metal badge still in her hand. "Ma'am, we responded to a report from building security," she said carefully. A suspicious individual was observed loitering and speaking into an earpiece. The call came in vague, but there was concern he might be casing the facility. Once on site, we confirmed he was armed, and we followed standard protocol. Standard protocol, Maya repeated, her eyes narrowing, as she turned slowly toward Daly, who remained silent, rigid, his face locked in the kind of neutral mask that only fools mistake for control. "Does your protocol include ignoring federal identification and forcing a veteran agent to the floor after credentials are presented?" Elijah raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to offer clarity. "I informed them of my status, repeatedly, told them my badge was in my satchel. Never once moved without instruction." Maya looked back at Torres, who now seemed visibly uncomfortable, her gaze flicking toward Daly, as if silently begging him to speak, to step up to carry some of the weight he'd helped pile onto the situation. But he didn't. Instead, he stared just past them all at something invisible on the far wall, as if the silence might protect him from responsibility. Maya's voice lowered not in volume but in tone, and somehow that made it even more commanding. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, turning her full attention now to both officers. "Special Agent Carter is here under my direct authority for a joint task force meeting regarding a cyber intrusion linked to federal infrastructure. His presence was scheduled, logged, and confirmed. And you've had his credentials in your possession for several minutes." There was no shouting, no threats, no dramatics, just a truth spoken with surgical precision, and that truth landed heavier than any accusation could have. Elijah slowly pushed himself off the floor, taking his time, letting his body uncoil from the discomfort he had absorbed in silence. His knees cracked softly as he stood brushing his palms against his slacks before lifting his chin and finally making eye contact with Daly again. "9 minutes," he said simply. "That's how long I was on the floor while you looked at me like I was a bomb about to go off." Rachel shifted behind the reception desk, the weight of those words hitting her visibly. She took a small step forward, her voice thin and uncertain. I didn't know. I just thought—" "You didn't ask," Elijah cut in, not cruelly, not loudly, just firmly. "You made a judgment based on fear. Or maybe assumption. But not fact." Torres cleared her throat and tried again to soften the edges. "Ma'am, I understand now that we were incorrect. But we had to ensure everyone's safety." Elijah looked at her, then at Maya, then back at Daly, who still hadn't spoken. "You had the badge," Elijah said. "You had the photo ID. You had everything you needed to verify me. And yet I sat there while he nodded toward Daly, waited for a mistake I wasn't going to make." Maya exhaled slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a card. "If you still need confirmation," she said, handing it to Torres, "that's my direct line. But let me save you the trouble. Agent Carter is a 10-year Bureau veteran. He's led operations in 6 states, holds 3 service commendations, and has security clearance higher than either of you could access without direct authorization." She paused just long enough to let that settle, then added, "He was also scheduled to interview candidates for a joint task force this week. We've been reviewing applications since last Monday." Something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not instantly, but it shifted all the same. Daly blinked once, just once, but it was the first reaction he'd shown in over 5 minutes, Maya noticed. In fact, she continued, her voice still calm, but with an edge now honed to razor's width. "One of those applications belonged to a city officer. solid field experience, a few commendations, even handled a hostage negotiation solo. Promising file. She let the silence hang for a beat before saying it. Name on the file was Brent Daly. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a full second, it seemed no one breathed. Elijah looked at Daly again, not smug, not triumphant, but with a gaze that saw straight through him. "I'd marked that file for an interview," he said. "Thought the candidate had potential, good instincts. Seemed like someone who could judge character." Daly didn't reply. Couldn't, maybe. His lips parted as if a word might escape, but nothing came out. The lobby, once filled with quiet threat, now settled into a silence far heavier, one born not of tension but of consequence. And in that silence, Elijah adjusted the strap on his satchel, squared his shoulders, and said nothing else. Because sometimes the most powerful statement is the one you don't have to say twice. The seconds that followed felt strangely detached from time itself, as if the walls had leaned in to listen, as if the floor had recorded every breath and movement, like some impartial witness to the quiet unraveling of power. Elijah remained still for a beat longer, his eyes locked not on Daly, who now looked like a man shrinking inside a uniform, but on the space just beyond him, where judgment had tried and failed to find something it could name as a threat. There was no anger in his face, no gloating, just the kind of steady, quiet gravity that settles over someone who's endured this type of scrutiny more times than he cares to admit. Maya Hall, still standing with that folder tucked under one arm and authority coiled neatly around every syllable she spoke, took one step closer and turned slightly toward Rachel at the front desk. "I trust building security will update their report," she said, her voice level. Rachel gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, her face flushed with a kind of embarrassed resolve, the way someone looks when the reality of their assumptions finally catches up to the impact they've caused. I will," she murmured. "I didn't mean," but the words died in her throat, because even she knew that intent had very little weight when the result was 9 minutes of silent accusation laid out like a trap no one dared admit had been set. Elijah didn't need to hear an apology. He'd heard versions of it before, soft, unsure, dressed in explanations that tried to excuse everything but acknowledged nothing. Instead, he turned toward Maya, the tension in his shoulders finally starting to unravel, not entirely, but enough to breathe without bracing. "You still want to do this upstairs?" he asked quietly. Maya looked at him for a long second, reading his face, measuring whether he was asking out of obligation or readiness, then gave a single nod. "I do," she said, "but only if you're good with it." Elijah adjusted the strap on his satchel, the motion small but deliberate, a signal that he was re-entering the role that had been briefly stripped from him. Agent strategist, professional, not suspect, not intruder. "Let's get it done," he replied, voice even. "We've already lost enough time." As they moved toward the elevator, Daly remained rooted to the spot, as if his boots had grown into the floor, unable or unwilling to retreat or engage. His hands hung useless at his sides, and for the first time since entering the building, he looked less like an officer and more like someone trying to make sense of the ground falling out from under his assumptions. Torres gave him a sidelong glance, then slowly walked past him without speaking, her face thoughtful, her jaw tight, not angry exactly, but carrying something heavier than silence. The elevator doors slid shut, with a soft chime sealing Elijah and Maya inside a smaller, quieter world. The ride up was silent for the first few seconds, both of them staring ahead, watching the numbers climb, letting the hum of the motor fill the space between them. Then Maya turned slightly, her voice low and measured. "You? Okay?" Elijah took a breath, slow and careful, then exhaled through his nose. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired." She nodded, not pushing further, not needing to. That word tired carried layers between them that didn't need to be unpacked right now because they both knew what it meant. Not physical fatigue, but the weight of being doubted, delayed, disbelieved again. When the elevator opened on the 5th floor, the hallway ahead was bright and quiet, lined with brushed steel and frosted glass, the kind of setting meant to inspire confidence and professionalism. Elijah walked a step ahead, now posture tall, steps measured, moving like a man who had reassembled himself mid-fall and wasn't going to let anyone see the seams. Maya followed at his side, and together they entered the conference room, already prepped for the cybersecurity briefing that had been the only reason he'd walked into that lobby in the first place. The monitor on the far wall displayed the Orion Technologies logo surrounded by nodes of encrypted data points and flagged security threats. A digital forensics specialist sat near the head of the table, eyes flicking up from her tablet as they entered. "Agent Carter," she greeted, not missing a beat. "We've been reviewing the breach logs from last week. You're going to want to see this." Elijah gave her a small nod, set his satchel on the table, and began unpacking his materials, like nothing had happened, because in this room at this moment, that was the only way to proceed. He clicked open his laptop connected to the secured system and projected his own analysis onto the screen with the same fluidity he'd used in dozens of high-level briefings before. His voice was clear, his words crisp, his rhythm steady. It wasn't performance, it was professionalism reasserted in real time, the kind that refused to be unraveled by someone else's failure to recognize it. But downstairs, the tension had not dispersed as cleanly. Torres finally walked over to Daly, her voice low enough to keep it from bouncing off the marble. "You all right?" she asked. Daly didn't answer right away. He stared at the elevator doors, watching the place where Elijah had disappeared like he might still be able to undo the last 10 minutes by thinking hard enough. "I applied to the bureau," he said quietly. "I thought I had what it takes." Torres tilted her head slightly, crossing her arms. "Maybe you do," she replied. "But today might be the first real test." He didn't respond, just stood there, his face flickering between defensiveness and realization, like a man catching his reflection in a broken mirror. Torres glanced at the reception desk where Rachel had disappeared behind the glass partition, her seat empty, her monitor still on but flickering with a standby screen. No one had asked her to leave, but she had, and no one rushed to bring her back. Some silences just settled too deep to be filled. And that's the thing about moments like this. They don't erupt, they sink in. Quietly, persistently, until the people left standing have to decide whether to dig them out or let them harden into something permanent. Daly didn't move. Torres didn't push. Because the next move, the next word, that wasn't part of procedure anymore. That was character. Upstairs in the fluorescent calm of the conference room, Elijah Carter moved through the digital presentation like a man who had nothing left to prove, even though the last half hour had tried to strip that away. His voice carried a practiced rhythm, measured and clear, but beneath every word was a quiet current, one that told you, this wasn't just another briefing, not just another day. Maya Hall sat to his left arms, folded eyes, steady, not intervening, not rescuing, simply bearing witness to the way he took back, control one word, one slide, one breath at a time. The forensics team, polite and attentive, clicked through their data and asked questions when needed, but none of them asked why Elijah's slacks were creased at the knees or why his voice dipped slightly when referencing the delay. He didn't offer it either. Some things didn't belong in reports. The air conditioning hummed above them, cold, but even as if the room itself refused to acknowledge that anything unusual had just happened on the floor below. Elijah noted how quickly everything had returned to a professional rhythm, how neatly discomfort could be folded and filed away when the facts were inconvenient. Yet even as he advanced the next slide, displaying a heat map of intrusion attempts on a secure government server, his mind kept returning to the lobby, not out of anger, but out of the fatigue that comes from knowing how easily truth can be delayed when trust is denied. After the meeting, the team thanked him, their expressions polite, professional, efficient. No one lingered, no one probed. Elijah packed up his laptop, his gestures quiet and precise, the same way surgeons handle instruments steady, even when the cut has already been made. Maya waited until the last person had left the room before she spoke again. "You didn't miss a beat," she said gently. "I couldn't afford to," Elijah replied, not looking at her, just coiling the laptop cord with the same discipline he applied to everything else. "You shouldn't have had to carry it like that," she added, softer now. He paused, closed his satchel, and finally met her gaze. "But I did." There was nothing bitter in his voice, no fire. Just the sound of someone who had learned that dignity wasn't about winning, it was about not folding under weight someone else tried to put on your shoulders. They exited the conference room in silence, walking down the hallway that now felt longer than before, though the walls hadn't moved. As they approached the elevator, Maya stopped and pulled out her badge to access the secure stairwell nearby. "Want me to walk you down?" she offered, not out of protocol but care. Elijah gave her a small smile, the kind that only lifted one side of his mouth. "I've got it," he said. "Thanks." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Maya held his eyes for another second, nodded once, then turned away. Elijah stepped into the elevator alone, the doors sliding shut with a soft sigh that echoed a bit too much. He stood motionless as the car descended, his reflection in the steel panels. Not defiant, not broken, just composed in that way. Someone learns when they've had to gather themselves too often in spaces that refuse to meet them halfway. When the doors opened again, the lobby had mostly cleared its earlier tension tucked into corners. No one dared revisit, but not everyone had left. Officer Torres stood near one of the concrete pillars by the main entrance, her arms folded loosely across her chest, her stance casual, but her eyes focused. She didn't move when she saw him, she simply waited. Elijah stepped out his gate, relaxed but aware, not wary, just attentive. He passed by her almost fully when she finally spoke. "Agent Carter." He turned slightly, not surprised, not guarded, just open enough to listen. "I waited," she said, "because there's something I need to say. No one told me to. This is just me." He said nothing, only shifted his weight slightly, giving her space to continue. "I read your ID. I saw your credentials. I knew it was all real. And I still stood there while my partner pushed it too far," she said, her voice steady but honest. "I didn't question it out loud. I didn't challenge him. I just let it happen. I was part of that." Elijah looked at her, his face unreadable. Not hard, but not easy either. "Why tell me this now?" She inhaled deeply before answering. "Because I don't want to be another person who saw what was happening, understood it, and stayed silent anyway." He studied her face. There was no performance there, no attempt to wrap herself in redemption. She wasn't justifying or defending, just standing in front of the thing she didn't want to carry forward. It mattered even if it came late. "Sorry doesn't fix much," Elijah said quietly. "I know," she replied. "But accountability starts when you stop pretending you weren't part of it." He nodded once, just enough to register what she'd said, then let a breath escape from somewhere low in his chest. "Most people never even get that far," he said. There was a pause, not awkward, just full, like a space finally being acknowledged. Torres gave a faint smile, the kind that comes from realizing you can't go back, but maybe you can move forward differently. "You think he still has a shot at that task force?" Elijah didn't answer right away. His face shifted just slightly from stone to thought. "He does," he said eventually. "But only if he can be honest with himself first. The Bureau doesn't need agents who carry power and don't understand its weight." Torres nodded, her expression, pensive, thoughtful, maybe even grateful. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. As Elijah turned to leave, his steps calm, his shoulders relaxed. There was no triumph in his walk, just steadiness. He moved like a man who knew exactly who he was, not because of what had happened that morning, but in spite of it, and that's what lingered in the space he left behind. Not judgment, not anger, but the kind of quiet that comes only after someone chooses truth over comfort, even if no one claps when they do. The air outside was warmer, now touched by early afternoon sun, filtering down through the tall glass of the building's front facade. But Elijah barely registered the temperature as he stepped out, his thoughts still layered with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. The sound of his shoes against the pavement was steady and unhurried, each footfall quiet but certain, as if he was walking, not away from something but toward the clarity that always followed confrontation. The breeze caught the edge of his blazer and lifted it slightly, but he didn't adjust it. He just kept walking, shoulders straight, face composed, every line of his body saying, "I'm still standing. I always will." Behind him, the lobby faded into glass and echo, but the memory clung to him like the last notes of a heavy chord, one struck in silence, left to vibrate through the bones. He didn't need to look back to feel who was still watching. Some moments don't need eyes. They live in the tension between what happened and what could have been avoided. He'd made it halfway across the parking turnaround when a voice called out, not loud but direct, "Agent Carter." He paused, turned slightly, and saw Officer Daly standing near the column at the edge of the lobby entrance just beneath the shade of the overhang. Daly wasn't in a stance anymore. He wasn't squared up or projecting anything. He just looked like a man carrying something too heavy for one hand and too late for explanation. Elijah turned fully, not defensive, not cold, just present, waiting. Daly took a few steps forward, slow but deliberate, his hands visible, not quite nervous, but clearly without a script. For a second, he seemed unsure of how to start the way a man does when he's realizing the words in his head might not be enough. "I saw your name on that file," he said, finally, his voice lower than before, softer around the edges. "Didn't put it together when I walked in." Elijah gave a small nod. "You weren't meant to. That's the point of a review." Daly rubbed the back of his neck, eyes shifting to the pavement before coming back up. "I wanted that assignment," he said. "Still do." There was no entitlement in the way he said it, just a faint trace of something more fragile, hope, maybe, or the early roots of regret. Elijah didn't speak right away. He studied Daly's posture, his face the way he stood now, not as a cop, not as a candidate, just as a man trying to find footing after slipping on the assumptions he hadn't known were loose beneath him. "You wrote in your application," Elijah said, "that you wanted to make an impact, that you believe in protecting people." "I do," Daly answered quickly, like that truth mattered more now than it had this morning. "But I guess I wasn't looking very hard at who needed protection today." There it was, unscripted, imperfect, real. Elijah crossed his arms, not closed off, just grounding himself as he asked, "When you walked into that lobby, what did you see?" Daly hesitated, then answered with a kind of painful honesty that didn't dodge anything. "I saw a man standing alone, talking low, looked alert, looked like he didn't want to be seen." Or, Elijah replied calmly, "A man preparing for a federal briefing. With an earpiece, a suit, a badge." Daly let out a slow breath, the kind that comes not from exhaustion but awareness. "You're right, I didn't see it. I didn't let myself see it." "That's the part that matters," Elijah said. "Not the mistake, the part where you refused to reevaluate the moment the facts changed." Daly nodded slowly, his shoulders no longer stiff, just heavy with the truth finally being held in both hands. "I froze," he said. "Not from fear, from ego. I thought letting up would make me look weak. And instead," Elijah replied gently, "you let power become a shield against reflection. That's always the more dangerous kind." They stood there in silence for a moment, just two men in a parking loop surrounded by glass and concrete, the quiet broken only by the distant roll of tires along the far road and a bird chirping somewhere overhead. No audience, no performance, just aftermath. Daly looked up. "Is the interview still happening?" Elijah thought about it, let the question hang long enough for it to sting just a little, not as punishment but perspective. "Yes," he said eventually. "But next time we sit across from each other, I won't be the only one asking questions." Daly's mouth twitched, half a nod, half a wince, like someone recognizing how much further they had to go, and realizing that growth and grace weren't the same thing, but sometimes followed the same road. Elijah turned to go, offering no handshake, no parting speech, because sometimes dignity doesn't require ceremony, it just needs truth to be met with stillness and accepted without excuse. He walked across the rest of the parking circle's sunlight, warming his back, the pressure in his chest finally beginning to release, not all at once, but in steady, silent waves. And as he reached his car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat, he sat there for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw unclenched. 9 minutes on the floor. That's all it took to reveal the cracks in a system that dressed itself in protocol, but couldn't see past the surface of a man. But it didn't end there, because something had shifted. Not loud, not fast, but deep. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again on better ground. Elijah didn't drive off right away after the conversation with Daly. Instead, he sat in his car for a moment, the engine still off the keys, resting in the ignition like a question he wasn't ready to answer. The quiet inside the vehicle was a different kind of silence than the one in the lobby. It wasn't about tension anymore, but about release, the kind of heavy stillness that settles when adrenaline fades and reflection begins. His hands remained on the steering wheel, not clenched, but steady fingers, resting lightly at 10 and 2, the way he'd been taught years ago when control still felt like a new concept instead of a familiar burden. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dash, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to simply breathe, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the windshield, where the road curved gently towards something quieter than judgment. He thought of the elevator, the marble floor, the way Maya's voice had cut through the space like a scalpel. He thought of Torres, of how she stood there afterward, not running, not defending, just owning what she hadn't done and what she still could. And then he thought of Daly standing under that shaded column, stripped of command, of certainty, of the armor that had once come from a badge, but now felt like weight he wasn't sure how to carry anymore. Elijah finally turned the key and let the engine come to life, the soft hum breaking the stillness, like a breath finally exhaled. He pulled slowly out of the lot, watching the building shrink in his rearview mirror, until it became just another shape in the landscape, concrete and glass, no longer holding the same sting it had only hours before. But he knew better than to believe the memory would fade just because the moment had passed. These kinds of encounters had a way of lingering, not like open wounds but like scar tissue you could still feel on the inside even after the skin looked smooth. As the road opened up before him, he allowed his mind to drift back, not as an escape but as a kind of inventory. He remembered the first time he'd been asked for ID at a conference he was invited to speak. Remembered the sideways glances in airports, the repeated instructions to keep his hands visible, the false alarms that always began with someone thinking he didn't look like he belonged. Each of those moments had etched something into him, not bitterness, not resentment, but a clarity so sharp it became second nature. A clarity that taught him how to stay still, under pressure, how to speak gently, even when the room was screaming with doubt, how to make space for the truth, without expecting it to walk in on its own. He reached a red light, and slowed to a stop, the afternoon sun pouring through the windshield, warm now against his collarbone. The world outside kept moving. Cars rolled past, children biked down the sidewalk, and two teenagers stood at a crosswalk, arguing about something that looked more urgent to them than anything Elijah had faced that day. It was a reminder that life doesn't pause just because justice stumbles, it just keeps going. And it asks you to keep moving too, even when your spirit wants to stop and unpack the weight of everything that almost broke you. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat. A text from Maya. "You good, want to debrief?" Elijah stared at it for a few seconds, then typed back, "Not now, I just need a little quiet." She didn't reply right away, and he didn't expect her to. Sometimes, silence was the most respectful answer. The light turned green, and he eased forward, merging onto the main road, surrounded now by the rhythm of traffic, the small movements of strangers who had no idea what kind of moment he was carrying behind the wheel. That too felt oddly grounding. The world wasn't watching him anymore. He could just exist. For a few minutes, he didn't have to represent anything but himself. Still in his chest, something churned, not rage, not even sadness, but a deep, quiet conviction that wouldn't sit still. A voice in his head that whispered not just about what had happened, but about how close it had come to spiraling into something far worse. Because he knew it only took one wrong breath, one twitch, one officer on a worse day, and this story wouldn't have ended with words exchanged in the sun, it would have ended with headlines and silence. At a gas station he pulled in not because he needed fuel but because he needed to stretch, to breathe outside the vehicle, to feel his own body grounded on his own terms. He stepped out, felt the air hit his face, the sound of tires against gravel, the smell of hot asphalt mixing with distant pine trees. It reminded him he was still here, still standing, still choosing how to walk through the world even after it tried to shove him down. A man at the next pump glanced over, nodded politely. Elijah returned the gesture without hesitation. It wasn't always a performance. Sometimes it was just two people acknowledging they were still human in a world that too often forgot that's what we all are. Back in the car, he sat down again, this time without the heaviness in his limbs. He started the engine once more and pulled onto the road, watching the lines blur beneath him mile by mile. He didn't have to figure it all out today. He just had to keep going. And as the building behind him disappeared, so did the last echoes of that marble floor. But the lesson, that stayed with him. The evening light had softened by the time Elijah pulled into his driveway, the sky stretching above him in hues of copper and lavender, the kind of dusk that looked quiet even before the world fell still. He sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, listening to the engine tick as it cooled the soft creak of the leather seat beneath him as he leaned back watching shadows crawl slowly across the dash. There was no one waiting at the window, no dog barking from the yard, just the stillness of home settling back into place after a day that had stretched longer than expected in every direction. He let his fingers rest on the steering wheel a few seconds more, breathing deep, not to brace, but to release, to allow the space between chaos and calm to widen just enough so he could step into it. When he finally opened the door, the sound was subtle but grounding, the dull pop of the seal, breaking the gentle groan of the door swinging open. His shoes crunched softly over gravel as he walked to the porch, keys in hand, body moving with the weariness that only comes when you're no longer performing strength for someone else. Inside, the house was dark but familiar, the kind of quiet that welcomed rather than judged. He dropped the keys into the small wooden tray by the door, slipped off his blazer, and laid it gently over the back of the nearest chair, not folded, not tossed, just placed. The kitchen held the faint smell of coffee from earlier that morning, cold now but still present like a memory that hadn't quite let go. Elijah poured a glass of water from the pitcher in the fridge, the clink of ice against glass echoing slightly in the open space. He took a sip, leaning one hand against the counter, staring out the window into his small backyard where the last light clung to the fence line and the tips of the grass glowed gold. He wasn't thinking about the meeting anymore, not the data breach, not the presentation, not even the questions from the younger analysts who had watched him like he belonged there, which he did. What stayed with him now were the words Torres had said and the ones Daly hadn't, not because they hurt, he was past that, but because of what they revealed. The silence wasn't about fear anymore. It was about the burden of realization, the way people freeze, not from danger, but from the weight of seeing themselves clearly for the first time. And maybe, just maybe, that was more dangerous than any hostility, that long pause before change, where ego wrestles with truth in a room no one else can enter. He sat at the edge of the couch, hands folded around the glass, not out of habit but grounding. His mind drifted not far, just gently toward the moment Daly had asked if the interview was still on. It would have been easy to say no, to let rejection be the lesson, to show him what consequences looked like when power was used without insight. But something deeper in Elijah had resisted that. Not out of kindness, not out of obligation, but out of a tired, clear understanding that accountability doesn't grow in the shadow of punishment. It takes root in the light of uncomfortable reflection. Elijah had spent years doing the work, investigating, analyzing, confronting external threats, but the older he got, the more he realized that the most corrosive danger wasn't always hidden in emails or networks. It was in the quiet judgments passed in lobbies, in the stories people told themselves to explain why they reached for control before reaching for understanding. And the hardest part was this: those judgments weren't always loud. Sometimes they sounded like policy, or like silence, or like a hand resting too close to a holster for too long. His phone buzzed again, this time not a message from Maya but an email notification. It was from the Bureau's internal application portal. He opened it, glanced at the name Brent Daly. The system had logged his application update status still active. Elijah looked at it for a few seconds, then archived the message without response. Not as a dismissal, but as a pause. Some conversations weren't finished yet. They were just waiting for the next moment to continue. He stood, stretched, walked back toward the window glass, now empty in his hand. Outside, the yard had gone dark except for a single solar light by the path glowing soft and steady, like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. The world hadn't changed today. It hadn't suddenly gotten fairer, or safer, or more forgiving. But something had shifted. Something small but real. A decision had been made. A mirror had been held up, and someone had stayed in the room long enough to face what it reflected. That wasn't nothing. He turned off the kitchen light and headed down the hallway, the floor warm beneath his socks, the night quiet, the kind of quiet earned after a day that had asked more of him than it had offered. And as he passed the framed photograph on the wall, his academy graduation, his mother standing beside him proud and quiet, he touched the corner of the frame without really thinking, like it was habit or prayer. "You did good," he whispered to the room, or maybe to himself, or maybe to her. Then he closed the bedroom door behind him, letting the night have its peace. The next morning came not with urgency, but with that slow, deliberate light that creeps in under closed blinds, as if the day itself is unsure of its welcome. Elijah rose before the alarm, not because he hadn't slept, he had deeper than expected, but because his body was tuned to the rhythm of preparation, of being ready before the world asked him to be. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, his bare feet resting flat on the hardwood floor, elbows on his knees, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the floor like it held some quiet answer he hadn't asked for yet. The room was silent, except for the soft click of the wall clock ticking through time, with no concern for what filled it. Down the hall, the smell of fresh coffee began to drift from the kitchen, automatic, consistent, programmed years ago, and never reprogrammed, like so many habits that stayed because they worked. Elijah moved through his morning in silence, shaving with slow, steady hands, dressing in a crisp navy shirt and slacks, without glancing too long in the mirror, tying his shoes with a quiet deliberation that felt more like meditation than routine. By the time he stepped outside, the sun had fully breached the rooftops, painting the sidewalk gold, and warming the air just enough to suggest that maybe this day would unfold differently. The drive to the field office was uneventful, just traffic lights, the occasional turn signal clicking, and a city waking up around him without realizing what nearly happened yesterday. Elijah didn't play, music didn't scroll through radio stations, didn't need distraction. He needed clarity, the kind that rides beside you when you've chosen not to carry bitterness but still feel the sting. The kind that sits in your passenger seat like an old friend who no longer needs to speak to be heard. At the office, the lobby felt different. Not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone else. But to him, the air was thinner, more aware. The receptionist greeted him with a nod and a smile that was polite but not performative, and as he passed through security, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass, a man composed, intact, and still here. Still doing the work. Still showing up, even when the room hadn't earned him. Upstairs in the briefing room, he found Maya already waiting. She had a folder in front of her, a fresh mug of tea beside it, and that same unreadable calm in her posture that always meant she was thinking 5 moves ahead. She looked up when he entered, met his eyes without hesitation, and gestured toward the chair across from her. "Morning," she said simply. Elijah nodded. "Morning." He sat down, rested his hands on the table, and waited, not because he was uncertain, but because he respected the silence between people who understood timing matters more than words. Maya slid the folder toward him. "Daly submitted a supplemental letter late last night," she said, attached to his application file. "Said he didn't want it to be part of the official review, just something for internal reflection." Elijah raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't speak. He opened the folder, scanned the short letter, his eyes tracing each line with the precision of someone trained to notice what's not being said as much as what is. The tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't polished. It read like a man who had finally understood that his own perception wasn't the truth, it was just the lens he'd been unwilling to challenge. "I think he means it," Maya said after a pause. Elijah closed the folder, his fingers resting on the edge. "Meaning it is the first step," he replied. "But it's not the finish line." "No," Maya agreed. "It's not. But it's a step we don't always see." There was another silence then, but this one held a different weight. Not the tension of yesterday's standoff, not the regret of a moment misjudged, but the cautious possibility that maybe, just maybe, awareness had started to root itself where it hadn't before. Elijah leaned back in the chair, exhaled through his nose, and looked out the window toward the horizon, where the sun now climbed higher, unapologetic in its brightness. "I don't need him to apologize to me," he said finally. "I need him to be better the next time he's in the room with someone who doesn't look like him." Maya gave a quiet nod. "That's what I told him. That you don't get a second chance at first impressions, but you do get a choice in who you become next." That sat with them both for a moment like something too sharp to touch but too important to ignore. Elijah stood folder in hand and turned to leave. "I'll keep him on the list," he said as he reached the door. but he's got to know that the interview won't just be about qualifications anymore. It'll be about character. Fair enough, Maya replied. As he stepped back into the hallway, the hum of office life resumed around him, phones ringing, footsteps, passing printers, churning out pages. No one would read twice. But within that normalcy, something different pulsed beneath it all, subtle but sure. A truth had been spoken, a lesson had been heard, and a standard had been set. And Elijah, like always, walked forward, not because the system was perfect, not because the struggle had ended, but because someone had to be the one to hold the line and say, this is what dignity looks like. This is what responsibility feels like. This is what justice starts to sound like when you stop whispering and finally speak it plain. By late afternoon, the light had started its slow retreat across the windows of the federal field office, drawing long gold slashes across the floor as the building settled into that quiet space between business and dusk. Elijah stood near the back stairwell, not in a rush to leave, but not lingering either, just breathing in the quiet that came after the noise, the reflection that always arrived once the last task had been filed and the final words had been spoken. The hallway was mostly empty, now voices faded behind closed doors, the echo of footsteps softened by distance, the hum of overhead lights sounding almost like memory. He looked down at the badge clipped to his belt, not for validation, not for reassurance, but out of habit, out of a quiet, personal ritual that reminded him who he answered to. Not the agency, not the hierarchy, but the values he brought into the room when no one else would speak. The badge had weight, yes, but it was the kind you carried from the inside, not something anyone could hand you or take away. As he turned toward the elevator, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the narrow glass of the fire door, slightly warped, slightly faded, but unmistakably present. He didn't stop to study it, but something in his posture softened, as if seeing himself from the outside gave him permission to admit just how much that day had taken out of him. Not physically. Not even emotionally, really. But spiritually, in that quiet, unspoken way, fatigue nests inside a person's ribs when they've had to hold still longer than they should have ever needed to. Downstairs, the lobby looked different now, not because the marble had changed or the light had shifted, but because the weight that had pressed into its walls that morning had finally started to lift. There were no officers, no whispers, no tension in the air pretending to be protocol. Just a woman vacuuming near the glass doors, the quiet buzz of maintenance equipment, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner rising from the tiled floor. Elijah walked slowly through the space, not drawing attention, not needing to. And yet the space seemed to acknowledge him in its own way, as if something about the energy had been altered, not fixed, not reversed, but realigned. He approached the glass exit, pausing for a moment beneath the overhang, before pushing through the doors and stepping into the fading warmth of the day. Outside, the wind was softer than it had been that morning, rustling through the trees that lined the corporate park like a breath that hadn't yet turned into a word. Across the lot, the same security guard from earlier leaned against the booth, sipping from a thermos, eyes half-lidded from a long shift. When he saw Elijah, he nodded once, curt but not cold. Elijah nodded back. Nothing else needed to be said. The lot was half empty now, cars thinned out like a room after a long meeting, everyone gone home to lives beyond the job, beyond the badge. Elijah reached his vehicle, opened the door, and sat inside, resting both hands on the wheel before starting the engine. But he didn't turn the key right away. He just sat there watching the way the trees cast shadows across the hood, watching the way light fractured in the rearview mirror, like time splitting into before and after. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. A message from Torres. Thank you for not walking away from the conversation. He stared at it for a few seconds, then typed a simple response. Keep walking forward. That's what matters. He didn't need to say more. Some words don't carry weight until they're lived through, and she would either carry them or she wouldn't. That wasn't his responsibility. His job wasn't to make people feel better. It was to show them what better looked like, especially when it wasn't convenient, especially when it required them to confront the parts of themselves they'd rather avoid. The engine hummed to life with a familiar sound, low and smooth, the same way it always did. But something inside him had shifted, nothing dramatic, nothing seismic. Just enough to remind him that standing your ground didn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it meant refusing to sit in silence when silence disguised itself as order. Sometimes it meant saying, "No, this isn't okay," in a voice calm enough to rattle the walls more than any shout ever could. As he pulled out of the lot, the streetlights blinked on overhead one by one, each glowing orb like a small promise that even in the dark clarity could still exist. He didn't look back at the building. Didn't need to. He knew the story didn't end there, not really. That lobby wasn't the end of anything. It was just one more chapter in a longer story. He had been writing with every quiet act of integrity, every moment of restraint, every time he chose patience over pride, clarity over ego, and truth over comfort. The road opened before him, and he drove without music, without distraction. The silence inside the car, not hollow, but full of thought, of memory, of the kind of hard-earned peace that doesn't always come with justice, but sometimes follows it anyway. He wasn't looking for closure. He wasn't waiting for the world to clap for him. He had no need for applause, because in the end, Elijah Carter didn't need to be thanked to know what was right. He just needed the world to look him in the eye when it got it wrong, and to remember his face long after he walked away. What happened to Agent Elijah Carter wasn't just a story about one man and one mistake, it was a reflection of something deeper in all of us. It reminded us that dignity isn't given by a uniform or a title, it's carried quietly in how we choose to treat one another when no one's watching. That the greatest strength isn't in how loudly we speak, but in how calmly we hold our ground when others expect us to fall. And most of all, it taught us that silence in the face of wrong doesn't protect us, it defines us. Whether you're wearing a badge, sitting behind a desk, or simply passing by, you have a choice to speak up, to pause, before you judge, to see the person, not the assumption. For those of us who've lived a little longer, we know that change doesn't come through grand gestures, it comes one moment at a time. And when we share stories like this, we pass down something that matters. Not just knowledge, but wisdom. Not just memory, but meaning. So if this story moved you even just a little, help us keep it alive. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor the truth, the struggle, and the strength of quiet resistance. Your support helps us bring these voices forward, and in doing so reminds the world that respect, justice, and humanity never go out of style.